Welcome to Nutrition Hero Podcast. This is Dr. Brad Watts coming at you once again, and today I'm excited to introduce you to a new friend of mine. He is a researcher at Baylor College of Medicine, and he's been doing quite the amount of research on nitric oxide and different applications. I'm excited to introduce to you Dr. Nathan Bryan. So without any further ado, here is Dr. Nathan Bryan.
Thanks you very much. It's a great pleasure and honor to be with you.
All right. I'm glad that you joined us. I appreciate your time today. And one of the things that I have found great value in over the years is nitric oxide and the research surrounding not only how it goes down in people's physiology, but how do you harness it and help restore function. And so I'm excited to talk about that today. Let's start here, though. Nitric oxide in the body, this is an hours and hours long conversation, but nitric oxide in the body, what are some of the highlights?
Well, I think, Brad, you highlighted a point here, and really that's been the holy grail in cardiovascular medicine, is how do you recognize what goes wrong in people that can't make nitric oxide, and then how do you restore the function and production of it? And really, that's been the focus of my research for the past almost 20 years. But at the core, nitric oxide is one of these molecules that's produced within the human body, and it tells other cells what to do. So it's a signaling molecule. So the best example is nitric oxide being produced by the lining of the blood vessels. It tells the surrounding smooth muscle to relax and dilate. And then when you relax and dilate blood vessels, you improve blood flow and perfusion to all tissues or that particular tissue. And you can do this upon need, upon demand, throughout the entire body. And so that's really how it was first discovered and recognized as a vasodilator. So without nitric oxide, you can't control and regulate blood flow to any tissue throughout the body. But we also know it's a neurotransmitter in the central nervous system, and it's actually produced by our immune system to kill off invading pathogens. So it's what we call a ubiquitous signaling molecule that is produced throughout the entire body. And when you can't make nitric oxide, a lot of bad things happen.
A lot of that, to put it mildly, right?
That's right.
So, all right. So one of the things that you had mentioned there was the immune system effect of nitric oxide. And that's not something that you find talked about commonly, at least I don't find talked about commonly right now. What else do you know about that as far as applications and a lot of the people that are listening, they're supporting patients that have autoimmune conditions, supporting patients that are dealing with maybe overreactivity of the immune system, but oftentimes also suppression, immunosuppression. How does nitric oxide fit in?
Well, that's actually led to a lot of confusion in the literature because the immune system, part of the innate immune response, so when we get an infection or an injury or some type of wound repair mechanism, then the first part of that is inflammation. And so acute inflammation in the body is actually part of our immune response. So it walls off the infection and brings the immune cells in and kills anything there and repairs the tissue. So nitric oxide being produced by the immune cells, it's about 1,000 or 10,000 times more than what's normally produced by the lining of the blood vessels, what we call these constitutive isoforms. And so during an acute inflammatory response, that's actually necessary. The problem is, and you hit it on the head, is people with autoimmune disease where you have this chronic inflammatory insult based on the foods we eat or some environmental toxin that's causing our body to have this inflammatory immune response. So what we found and what we discovered in probably over 10 years ago was that this acute overproduction of nitric oxide, part of the normal inflammatory response, but when this becomes in chronic conditions, it actually shuts down the constitutive production of NO. So chronically inflamed patients become deficient in nitric oxide. And that's where the confusion arises in the literature, because you'll find, well, in inflammation and autoimmunity, that nitric oxide is produced and is part of the injury response. Well, my analogy is that when there's a crime, police always show up at the crime, typically. But does that, just because the police are there, doesn't necessarily mean that they caused the crime. They're trying to police the crime and get things organized and together where people can do their job. And that's what nitric oxide does. And so just because nitric oxide is present in an inflamed tissue or inflammatory condition doesn't necessarily mean that it's part of the injurious response to inflammation.
That's awesome. That's a really good analogy. And you can totally see how the confusion would show up, though. if people are misunderstanding the role of nitric oxide in the first place.
That's right. And with over 150,000 papers published, you can find really anything you're looking for. So the challenge, not just for us research scientists in nitric oxide, but even consumers and patients and physicians who just try to comb the literature, is distilling out what's meaningful and what's not meaningful in the literature.
150,000 research articles. That's amazing because, like you said, you can basically find anything to back up what your opinion is. How hard is it to avoid having an opinion before you start doing research, even from a clinical perspective with this? How hard is it to stay off one side of the fence, so to speak?
Well, I've been immersed in this literature and science for almost 20 years, so I'm very familiar with the literature. But those on the outside looking in who want to learn about nitric oxide, there's a lot of confusion, and it's almost impossible to just do a cursory review of the literature and know what's really going on in the nitric oxide field in terms of how the human body generates nitric oxide, what disrupts nitric oxide production, how do you restore the function of that. And so that's really our job as basic scientists, to translate the basic science into what's meaningful and applicable to physicians and clinicians to best treat their patients. And that's really how science is designed to work. It's the basic scientists that go out and create the new technology, the innovations, the diagnostics, and then translate that into clinical care and point-of-care solutions for patients. And so that's why I enjoy doing these podcasts, because it allows me to, in really 20 or 30 minutes or less, is to tell you what really the summary of 20 years of basic science has told us.
Which kind of seems unfair for you, but when you are talking about the work that you're doing, I understand that you're working on a book currently. What's the newest project in this arena? What are you looking for?
Well, I think, for the past 20 years, we focused on the enzyme in the human body that makes nitric oxide. It's called nitric oxide synthase. Mm-hmm. So for years, people thought that's the only way the body makes nitric oxide. We and others discovered that there's really an essential role for oral bacteria, oral and gut bacteria, in generating nitric oxide. So this whole microbiome project, we're finding that generates about 50% of the human body's nitric oxide production. So if you don't have the right oral bacteria, then you become nitric oxide deficient. So this is a compensatory mechanism that if the enzyme can't make nitric oxide, then we can rely on the diet and bacteria. And when one can compensate for the other, but when both system fails, that's when bad things start to happen. And so now we can use the oral microbiome as a therapeutic target to restore nitric oxide-based signaling. And then really trying to my focus has always been, number one, if your body can't make nitric oxide, then how do we provide a source of nitric oxide? But number two, and perhaps most importantly, is we now understand what goes wrong in people that can't make nitric oxide. And we have the tools, the technology to restore the function of that. So we actually can get to the root of the problem, which medicine has failed to do for the past 100 years, is fix the underlying problem of why people become deficient in specifically nitric oxide production. And so really that's kind of exciting, because you can actually fix a problem and not just prescribe a drug or give a Band-Aid and treat the symptoms. You can get to the root of the problem.
What do some of the analytics look like with that? Like, how do you diagnose that style of an issue with somebody? If you're talking about actually getting to the root of it, I'm sure, as you're about to say here, there are going to be different triggers and that type of thing, different situations. But how do you go about analyzing it?
Well, that's been a major hurdle and obstacle in translation to patient care, because unlike things like vitamin D or lipids or magnesium that they're routine labs to measure, so those are easy. So if you're deficient in vitamin D, what do? You supplement vitamin D to restore normal levels. Right. Same thing with magnesium or any other metabolite or nutrient. But with nitric oxide, it's a gas, and so it's very difficult to detect, number one, in the human body. But there's no standard blood labs to measure nitric oxide production or capacity. And so what we've been able to do is really you look at the symptoms. So if you can't make nitric oxide, typically the first clinical manifestation and presentation would be an elevation in blood pressure, erectile dysfunction, because again, you're losing the ability to perfuse tissues upon demand. And then you'll see a decline in cognition, because in vascular dementia patients, there's reduced blood flow to the prefrontal cortex. And so it's really low blood flow to these specific tissues and organs that are the consequence of insufficient nitric oxide production. So number one, you look at the clinical presentation and the manifestation. If they've got reduced blood flow or poor circulation, that's a telltale sign of nitric oxide deficiency. But again, a slight elevation in blood pressure, sexual dysfunction, even metabolic syndrome is really a nitric oxide deficient problem. So we put the clinical pieces together, and then you can start to interrogate based on some blood labs that we're starting to correlate with nitric oxide production. And then, the easiest thing is to employ strategies to restore nitric oxide production, and people get better. It's that simple.
Very cool. One of the tools that has become available for practitioners in the marketplace today is genetic testing and looking for single nucleotide polymorphisms, that type of thing. And so when you mentioned nitric oxide synthase, that's something that a lot of people listening to this podcast right now will have come across either in informational flyer from the vendor or actually looking at the test results with their patients. How do you correlate a genetic SNP with endothelial nitric oxide synthase, let's say, and somebody that has IBS or leaky gut syndrome in that type of a situation? What's the clinical picture look like in your mind as the research scientist?
Well, if you're doing these advanced genetic tests and they have an eNOS SNP, then obviously that means that either one or both copies of that enzyme aren't working or fully expressed. So then these people are certainly, obviously, by definition, nitric oxide deficient. The other one that's directly influenced by the production of nitric oxide is this methyl tetrahydrofolate reductase enzyme, or an MTHFR, which is becoming more prevalent in Caucasians and people that at least live in the U.S. And so part of this enzyme, people understand it as the methylation pathway enzyme, but it's also responsible for the maintenance of a molecule called tetrahydrobiopterin. And that's the rate-limiting step in nitric oxide production. So MTHFR patients, by definition, become nitric oxide deficient. So that creates a pretty good clinical picture, but really the telltale sign in all this, and I like to combine genetic testing with biochemical testing, then with functional endothelial test. And there are a number of FDA-cleared medical devices out there that you can actually get a functional determination of nitric oxide production.
Awesome.
So when you combine those three, you really get a clear clinical picture of a nitric oxide deficient patient. But as we become experienced in seeing the clinical presentations, then you can actually begin to recognize when you see a patient with a number of different symptoms and presentations, it becomes clear that they have a nitric oxide problem.
So with the one of the things that you had mentioned is the microbiome, either in the gut or the oral cavity. What type of presentation are you looking for there to be able to look at it and say, hey, this patient likely has an issue with nitric oxide?
Yeah, so what we talked about earlier with the genetic and the functional and the biochemical labs, typically that'll give you a pretty good indication of enzymatic nitric oxide production, or how functional the enzyme is in the lining of the blood vessel. And so that's a very important question that you addressed. And so we addressed that almost 10 years ago by the development of a salivary test strip. And so you can place your saliva on the end of this test pad, and if it turns a bright pink, then that tells us that at least through the salivary bacterial metabolism that you can generate and produce nitric oxide. But if you can't turn that test strip pink, then it tells us, number one, you're nitric oxide deficient. But until you start interrogating the pathway, it doesn't necessarily tell us why you become nitric oxide deficient. But there's some cool steps that we've learned over the way that you can test to see if you have the right oral bacteria by taking testing and then going and eating some kale or spinach or arugula, some green leafy vegetables, and then 90 minutes later retesting that salivary test strip. And if it turns pink, then the bacteria are functional and working. If it doesn't turn pink, then you've got an oral microbiome problem.
So what style of, do you re-inoculate? Is there a culturing situation that has to happen? Is it like a 6-month process, a 1-day process? What's that like?
Well, we don't know, is the honest answer. We've learned a lot in terms of the role of the oral microbiome, but there's a lot more that we don't know than what we do know. So, number one, and I've submitted a number of patents on this because we know which bacteria are necessary and sufficient, but we're a long term to developing safe and effective prebiotics or probiotics to reinoculate.
Right.
What we're finding is that it may just be as simple as, because these are nitrate respiring bacteria. And we know that the Western diet, you really don't get enough nitrate in your diet to feed these bugs. So we're finding that maybe all you got to do is just change your diet and eat more green leafy vegetables that contain more nitrate. Then you give these bugs more substrate to respire on, and they'll wake up and start recolonizing and proliferating and provide you the enzymatic machinery that we as humans don't have.
Very cool. So what your company, Doctor, let's talk about that a little bit here. If you would, research and applications. What's going on right now in the business world for you?
Well, I'll take a step back and just say that we made a number of discoveries over a decade ago when I was on faculty at University of Texas Medical School in Houston, and part of that involves invention disclosures and submitting patents through the university. And then, when you find something that's going to have an impact on public health and in public the health and treatment of patients, then you can form companies. And so that's what I did about 8 or 9 years ago, and started this company called Neogenis Labs. Then it's now called Human to the Power of N. So what we've done is created really a functional nutritional company. And so, as I mentioned earlier, similar to vitamin D or magnesium or a lot of these other essential nutrients, that if you're deficient in that, then let's figure out a way to restore and supplement or replete these levels. And so there's a lot, that sounds simple, but there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes. Number one, we got to know how much nitric oxide a healthy person makes in 24 hours, how much you're getting from your diet, and if you're missing from this, then how do you simply restore those physiological levels of functional nitric oxide nutrition? So the company has done very well, but it's worth saying that we're not a drug company, we're not a pharmaceutical company, so nothing that we developed or bring to market is intended to cure, treat, diagnose, or mitigate any disease.
Right.
But what we do is, if your body's missing nutrients that are required for the production of nitric oxide, then we give those back. And so really the manifestation of, I guess, about 17 years of work now has been, almost a dozen issued U.S. and international patents. We've got 7 peer-reviewed, published clinical trials on our technology. It's probably one of the most successful technologies ever developed at the University of Texas Medical School in Houston. And so I think we've been innovators and pioneers in the nitric oxide space. And when you see people get better, and I get hundreds of emails every week on people's lives we've changed, and so that's probably one of the most gratifying things one can ever do. And that's the reason I got into basic science, was to make discoveries to impact the human race.
That's awesome. And so the website is humann.com, humann.com. And the technology that we're talking about specifically, can we talk about Neo40?
Sure. So as we talk about, not having, if you have a genetic SNP where the enzyme isn't functional, or you don't have the right oral bacteria, or you become deficient in a nutrient that's typically provided by the diet because you've got poor diet, then the fundamental question is, well, how do you overcome all these limitations? And that's where Neo40 comes in. So Neo40 does 2 things. Number one, if your body can't make nitric oxide for whatever reason, whether it's endothelial dysfunction, whether it's a genetic SNP in the enzyme that makes nitric oxide, whether it's poor diet, poor lifestyle, lack of oral bacteria, then that lozenge generates nitric oxide for you. So if you can't make NO, we do it for you. And we design the amount of nitric oxide that's released because we know how much nitric oxide is produced by a healthy young person with all these systems intact. So when that lozenge is dissolving, it's generating about 25 to 30 parts per million nitric oxide gas. It's the only technology in the world that generates and liberates NO gas. And then number 2, as I mentioned earlier, we actually fix the reason the body can't make nitric oxide. So the enzyme, the endothelial nitric oxide synthase enzyme, we incorporate technology in there that recouples that enzyme to where your body's own ability to make NO improves. So again, to recap, if you can't make NO, we do it for you. But number 2, the Neo40 fixes the reason you can't make nitric oxide. And we overcome
Which,
all the bacterial issues. So if you don't have the right bacteria, we do
right.
it for you. If you don't make stomach acid and you become nitric oxide deficient, we do it for you. So really, it's a complete, comprehensive nitric oxide restoration technology.
One of the things that I appreciate is the approach that you're taking is quite different than the approach of a pre-workout supplement for nitric oxide support, or something that's just utilizing L-arginine, etc. What has been your experience with the differences between Neo 40 and a typical L-arginine product that you would find off the shelf?
Yeah, that's a very good point. And so arginine, so the enzyme nitric oxide synthase in a young, healthy person with normal enzymatic function, this enzyme takes arginine and converts it to nitric oxide. So when you want to use it as a pre-workout and you have good endothelial function, then typically you can get some nitric oxide produced through that pathway. But this is oxygen dependent. So in endurance athletes, for instance, when you run out of oxygen, then the arginine pathway shuts down. But again, in sick people, older sick people that have become nitric oxide deficient, the enzyme that converts arginine to nitric oxide is broken. So giving arginine to a nitric oxide deficient person is like putting gas in a car with a blown up engine. It's not going to get you
Gotcha.
where you need to go. The engine's broken.
Right.
You're not out of gas. The engine's broken. So you got to fix the engine. So that's what we've been able to do. And so this other pathway that we've recently discovered is using inorganic nitrate or nitrate from green leafy vegetables that's metabolized and reduced to nitrite and nitric oxide. And so that's where the natural product chemistry comes in that we've discovered that basically makes this process much more efficient. So we've got two pathways to make nitric oxide. We can fix the one that's broken and then fuel the other one so that we're basically priming both pumps to restore both pathways to make nitric oxide.
That is really cool. When you have somebody, let's say a diabetes patient, and 75 years old, hasn't been able to have erectile function for 3 or 4 years, and that the whole story that goes along with that. Neo 40, is it an applicable molecule or an applicable therapeutic intervention for that style of a patient to support their natural ability to bring that function back? Is that something that you would consider?
Well, the Neo 40 is not going to treat diabetes or erectile dysfunction,
Right.
but here's what it would do. All of those conditions are really a clinical picture of insufficient nitric oxide production. So they're missing something that's lost the ability to produce nitric oxide. So what the Neo 40 can do is give these people the technology and the nutrients and everything that their body needs to make nitric oxide. So when you restore the normal production of nitric oxide in any person, no matter what their underlying condition is, then things will get better. Blood flow improves, insulin signaling will improve, because that's how nitric oxide works. Without it, these things break down, and that's the clinical picture. When you fix it, you basically you fix a lot of these underlying problems. So you can actually help the body support its own nitric oxide production.
Very cool. And I throw that out there because it's a common situation, especially if you're in the functional realm, helping people with dietary interventions, supplemental interventions, etc. That patient is the patient that knocks on your door every day. And so this is just a very cool bridge. I don't think you're going to find this technology anywhere else, which is what I appreciate about it, which is why I wanted to talk to you so bad anyway.
Well, thanks.
So,
It's important to me because the science has to be communicated. And in the space that we operate in, the so-called dietary supplement and nutrition space, a lot of these companies can say the exact same thing that we say in terms of help the body support nitric oxide, help the body. I mean, that's the legal language that we operate under. But here's what I tell people. Do the research and look for a product technology that, number one, are there any published clinical trials on that product? Not an ingredient in the product, but has that actual product been put to the test in human clinical trials? So that's an important consideration. Number two, are there any patents or intellectual property around that technology? And if not, there's probably no innovation around it. So it's nothing new, nothing different. Number three, is it licensed from a reputable university or medical school? And then number four, I think, is a very important consideration because the nitric oxide biology is very complex and complicated. And if you look at the company that manufactures these products, is the inventor have they published anything in the nitric oxide literature? Do they have any experience around nitric oxide biology? And when you ask yourself those 4 questions, there's only one product on the market, on the planet, that does that. That's the technology
Right.
we developed.
Very cool. So where's the research on nitric oxide leading at this point? Where are you headed in the future here? If this is current status, what's next for Neo40 or for a human to the power of N?
Well, I think we're at the very early stages of nitric oxide in medicine and in really public awareness. So I think as we advance the science, I think even today what's clear is that your body cannot and will not heal or get better until you fix the nitric oxide production pathways. I predict 7-8 years in the future, nitric oxide will be as common as somebody taking a daily multivitamin or taking a daily CoQ10 or fish oil. We all know the benefits of that. Nitric oxide is just now gaining that awareness, but I think we've got a 20 or 30-year runway with nitric oxide, and when we get this in the hands of more people and people start to realize the importance of nitric oxide in individual health and wellness, then I think it'll become pervasive. And that's my goal, is to get this technology in the hands of many people around the world as possible, because we have an epidemic of vascular problems. I mean, cardiovascular disease is still the #1 killer of men and women worldwide, and that is unacceptable to me, because we know why people get cardiovascular disease, and the earliest indication and the earliest event in the onset and progression of vascular disease is insufficient nitric oxide production. We know how to fix that.
Yeah.
And so when you fix that, you can basically do remarkable things in terms of health and wellness.
That's awesome. You have access, I would imagine, to clinical trials and patients that are going through university studies, et cetera. Do you have any plans to blow that up? Do you have any plans to put Neo40 on the map in a larger and greater way from a research perspective?
Yeah, that's our #1 motivation and mission. So as I mentioned, we have 7 published, peer-reviewed, randomized controlled clinical trials. We've got probably half a dozen, maybe more, clinical trials currently underway. So we want to get this and really do what other people in the supplement space don't do, is do these randomized controlled clinical trials and demonstrate proof of principle of safety and effectiveness in humans. And then when we advance that science, I think people will realize the importance of it. It'll be well validated in terms of safety and effectiveness in production in healthy people and people with some dysfunction.
So where do we go to get Neo40? How do I get it, doctor?
Well, you can certainly get it online. We can get it from your healthcare practitioner. Our motivation has always been, let's educate the docs and the clinicians. Those are the people on the front lines treating the patients, and really just bring awareness around nitric oxide to where then you can use your best medical judgment in terms of what's best for the patient. And if I do my job, then every clinician out there would realize the importance of nitric oxide and be able to recognize that that patient sitting in front of them probably has a nitric oxide problem. And there are now safe and effective dietary supplements and nutritional strategies that can support and improve their own nitric oxide production. And then when you do that, you can fix that. And there may be other things wrong with people that they didn't have to, use your best medical judgment on how to do that. But the nitric oxide and the Neo40 is going to be, I think, a hallmark of nutritional support for people around the world.
Very cool. Doctor, I got to tell you, thank you very much for joining us today. I appreciate your time and the research, yes, but not only that, the passion that you're going at it with. 20 years on the same topic, I have to applaud you for that. And if you're just getting started, more power to you.
Well, I think we are just getting started. We know it takes an average of about 17 years for new discoveries to become mainstream. My whole mission for the past about 10 years is to shrink that timeline, because this information is so powerful that we shouldn't have to wait 17 years for clinicians, patients, even consumers to be aware of this. So, that's why I'm, again, writing this book to try to educate not just physicians, but but also consumers and lay people and patients on the importance of nitric oxide. So then they can go to their physician or clinician and ask, hey, what is this nitric oxide stuff? Can I benefit from it?
Very cool. So if you're just joining us here today, we're talking with Dr. Nathan Bryan of Human to the Power of N, and about the product and the research that he's been just buried in and swimming through, I should say. About the product, though, Neo-40 and nitric oxide production, yes, and support. Very, very cool. So, Doctor, I appreciate your time, and I'd like to have you back at some point because you guys have a lineup of really cool things that I've found on your website, and have some patients that have experienced utilizing those products as well. Very cool. I would love to ask more questions about specifically the Beats products. Oh my goodness, very cool. So anyway, I appreciate your time today, and thank you for hanging out with us on the Nutrition Hero podcast.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your time.